The lights went low in the conference hall as the final speaker was introduced. At the International Leadership Forum in Geneva, a big event where global leaders, artists, and thinkers came together to talk about the future, the topic that night was how leaders should stay moral in a divided world. Denzel Washington, not just known for his acting, but also for being a respected voice in American culture, calmly walked on stage. The audience clapped warmly as he smiled, adjusted the mic, and started speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we live in a broken world torn apart by war, unfairness, and disappointment. Everyone has an answer. Some say money, some say change." He paused. "Some say faith." The crowd gave a soft laugh. Sitting next to him, Ibrahim Traoré didn't react. Denzel went on. "Faith, belief, tradition, you hear it all the time. People say their communities need something to believe in. But belief without action isn't leadership, it's just a show." This time, the laughs were louder. Some people looked at Traoré, since his speeches often talked about spiritual strength, tradition, and identity. Denzel added, "Let's be real, the world doesn't run on prayers. It runs on power, deals, and control. If you want to lead today, keep the sermons for church." The moderator stayed silent while the crowd, full of diplomats, CEOs, and media figures, murmured quietly. Cameras caught the moment and the tension. Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't move, but the room felt different. When it was finally his turn, he waited, looked around at the people, the lights, and the silence, and then stood. No one clapped. Everyone just waited. He spoke in a calm, steady voice that still filled the room. "You say faith is just a show," he began, "but I say power without faith is like a stage with no story." A few people leaned in to hear more. "You laugh at belief because it can't be measured because it doesn't come with a price tag or a battlefield. But let me ask you, Mr. Washington, what helped your people rise when they had no land, no weapons, and no right to vote?" Denzel looked up, caught off guard. "Was it not faith?" Traoré asked again. "Faith in justice, in dignity, in something greater than themselves." The room went quiet. People seemed to forget they were supposed to laugh or be entertained. Something deeper was happening, and Traoré was just getting started. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. The silence in the room became his strength. "When you laugh at faith," he said, looking directly at Denzel, "you're not laughing at rituals or chants. You're laughing at the one thing that gave millions the strength to get up every day." After being told they were nothing, Denzel shifted in his seat as the camera zoomed in. Traoré walked away from the podium, speaking slowly and clearly. "You say the world runs on power. I say the powerful fear the faithful more than they fear the armed. Because faith doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't need permission to resist or to rebuild." He let those words hang in the air. "In Burkina Faso, we pray before we plant, not because the soil is magic, but because we remember the years when it was stolen from us, when our gold wasn't ours, when our voices were silenced. Prayer isn't weakness, it's memory." A quiet murmur moved through the room. Denzel didn't speak, but his expression changed, no longer mocking, but curious. He hadn't expected this. Neither had anyone else. Traoré looked out at the crowd. "I'm not a preacher," he said. "I'm a soldier. I've buried friends who believed in nothing, and I've buried those who believed in everything. The difference was how they faced death. Faith isn't just a speech, it's a discipline, a code. And yes, it may sound like hope, but hope has built more nations than fear ever did." Finally, Denzel leaned toward the mic. "And what if that hope blinds you, Mr. President?" he asked carefully. "What if it makes you trust when you should fight?" Traoré didn't blink. "Then I'd rather die with hope in my chest than live with fear in my mouth." The energy in the room exploded, not with noise, but with impact. Journalists typed fast. Cameras flashed. Delegates looked at each other. This wasn't just a panel anymore. It was a moment of change. Even the moderator stumbled, trying to take back control. "Gentlemen, let's stay on topic," he said. But the topic had already changed right there. Live on stage. And Traoré hadn't even started talking about the West yet. The moderator, clearly nervous, tried to shift the conversation. "Let's open this up to a broader discussion on leadership values, perhaps," he suggested. "No," Traoré said firmly, "Let's finish this one." That one line changed the whole atmosphere in the room. The moderator stepped back unsure, and Traoré turned slightly toward Denzel, but spoke to everyone. "Some of you come from countries where faith is optional, where belief is a choice, even a luxury. But in my country, faith is like air. When our hospitals had no medicine, we prayed. When our rivers dried up, we believed the rains would come. Back when the world ignored us, we stood tall on nothing but conviction." He paused. "You call that weakness," he continued, "but I say that's where true strength begins." He looked around the room. The West often laughs at. The rituals of the South calls us primitive, backward. But we learned to kneel so that one day we could stand. Silence. Denzel now sat with his arms crossed, no longer smirking, just listening. "You want to know what real theater is?" Traoré asked. "It's this forum. We wear suits, shake hands, and smile for the cameras, while outside, corporations backed by powerful governments are still bleeding countries like mine dry." A wave of discomfort passed through the high-profile crowd. No one expected this panel to go there, especially not with cameras rolling and Western donors in the front row. But Traoré didn't stop. "You tell us to grow, but don't let. US own our seeds. You tell us to trade, but only by your rules. You admire our strength, but panic when we raise our voices." He turned back to Denzel. "You build a life by telling stories. I respect that. But we live those stories, and some of us are done being characters in someone else's script." Denzel finally leaned in toward the mic and asked quietly, "You think I'm the enemy?" "No," Traoré replied. "I think you forgot who the enemy is." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it felt sacred, like the room had suddenly remembered how to feel. Then, slowly, a delegate from South Africa stood and clapped. Another followed, from Haiti. Then one from Brazil. Traoré didn't smile. He wasn't performing. He was remembering and making sure they did too. What started as hesitant applause rolled through the room like distant thunder, real, raw, and completely unplanned. Delegates and observers from across the global South rose to their feet, and even those who didn't clap leaned forward, aware they were witnessing a moment they'd never forget. Denzel leaned back in his chair, and for a brief second, the cameras caught something shift in his eyes, not anger, not defeat, but respect. But this moment wasn't about him anymore. Traoré stepped forward, not toward the panel or the cameras, but toward the crowd, the young observers, the translators in their booths, the note-taking delegates. "For decades," he said, "we were told our voices didn't matter unless they echoed yours. We were taught to copy your systems, your diplomacy, your language." He paused. "But every time we spoke in our own voice, you called it radical. Every time we led with our own values, you called it regression. Every time we resisted your hand, you called it instability." Then, slowly raising a hand, he pointed to the back where younger delegates from Asia, Latin America, and Africa sat. "We weren't invited to the table," he said, "so we built our own." The room fell still. "Now, some of you fear this confidence," he continued. "You think it's nationalism or rebellion. It's not. It's restoration. It's what happens when a people remember who they are." The moderator didn't dare interrupt, even. The producers broadcasting live didn't cut away. Then Traoré looked back at Denzel, not with rivalry, but with a calm challenge. "You said the world doesn't run on prayers. Maybe not your world, but ours. Ours has survived on little else, and still we rise." Denzel leaned in, thoughtful now. "Mr. President," he asked, "what do you want from us then? Apologies, silence, for us to step aside?" Traoré shook his head. "No," he replied. "I want honesty. I want you to stop calling it help when it's control. Stop sending lectures disguised as aid. And most of all, I want you to listen." That last word hit like a gavel. The room was silent, not offended, not resistant, but caught in the rare stillness that comes when truth is spoken. Without anger, outside, social media was already on. Fire clips of the exchange were being translated into multiple languages. Traoré versus Denzel was trending, but so was a deeper question. Who gets to define leadership in a broken world? Inside, Traoré returned to his seat, but the audience hadn't fully sat down yet. As they slowly settled, Denzel remained quiet, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood the weight of what had just happened. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, not by politicians, not by diplomats, and especially not by a young man from a country Hollywood only mentioned when it was suffering. Finally, he leaned toward the mic. "I didn't come here to argue," he said. "I came here to talk about global leadership, but I'll admit it now. I misread the room." "And I misread you," Denzel said quietly. Traoré didn't respond with words, just a single nod. It wasn't forgiveness, it was acknowledgement. Denzel continued, "When I was growing up, the stories we heard about Africa were written by outsiders. Stories filled with war, disease, hunger. No one ever told us about sovereignty, dignity, resistance." He glanced down for a moment. "So when I joked about prayer and power, maybe I wasn't mocking faith. Maybe I was mocking a version of the world I thought I understood but didn't." The mood in the room shifted again, not with discomfort this time, but with appreciation for his honesty. "I don't agree with everything you said," Denzel added, "but I respect it. And more than that, I hear it." Traoré finally leaned toward his mic. "You're not the first to misunderstand Africa," he said. "You're just the first to admit it on stage." Laughter followed, not sarcastic or sharp, but warm, even healing. "And don't get me wrong," Traoré continued, "we don't need validation from the West. We don't need a seat at your table anymore because we've realized something powerful." He looked out at the audience. "We don't need a voice. We are the voice, this time." The applause came fast and strong from diplomats, students, staffers, even a few surprised Western attendees who hadn't expected to feel so deeply moved. The moderator, now fully aware that this panel had become something far bigger than planned, leaned into his microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I think we've just witnessed not a debate but a dialogue, the kind that shifts narratives, not just headlines." Denzel turned to Traoré and offered his hand. Traoré looked at it, then shook it, brief, firm, and meaningful. And somewhere in the back of the hall, a young African intern whispered to herself, This is what leadership looks like." The moment their hands met, cameras zoomed in like it was a truce on a battlefield. But what filled screens across the world wasn't war, it was something more powerful. A confrontation between truth and narrative, reverence and relevance. Major news outlets scrambled to interpret it. CNN ran the headline, "Hollywood Icon versus African President Tension at Global Values Summit." Al Jazeera framed it as, "Traoré confronts the West leadership on Africa's terms." Fox News called it, "Actor lectured by African leader, woke diplomacy or real talk." But in Ouagadougou, Bamako, Harar, and in group chats from Nairobi to the Bronx, the story felt different. It wasn't a feud, it was a mirror. And a young generation saw its reflection in Traoré, assertive, intelligent, and unmoved by the weight of legacy or fame. Traoré's words lit up social media across the globe. The line, "We don't need a voice, we are the voice," was instantly subtitled in French, Portuguese, Swahili, Spanish, even Mandarin. It was no longer just about one man, it had become a generational call. Some called it a turning point in global dialogue. Others, particularly within Western think tanks, labeled it dangerous populism. In Washington, a State Department advisor reportedly said behind closed doors, "We've created a monster. We wanted African leaders to be strong, not independent." Meanwhile, in Hollywood, reactions flooded in. Some praised Denzel for his humility, while younger black artists, activists, and filmmakers stood firmly behind Traoré. Back at the summit, the moderator called a short recess. As the audience stretched and networks scrambled for post-debate analysis, Traoré stepped off stage and was quickly surrounded by young journalists. A 23-year-old reporter from Ghana asked, "Mr. President, do you think the world is ready to hear what you said today?" Traoré looked straight into the camera. "The world doesn't have to be ready," he said. "We've waited long enough. Now it's our turn to speak." Denzel stood nearby, listening quietly. He didn't interrupt. In that moment, even he seemed to understand the conversation had moved beyond him. This was no longer a clash between two men. It was a shift between eras. A moment when an old world began to fade and a new one dared to speak. The summit resumed, with topics like climate policy, trade, and migration, but no one was really listening. The real summit had already happened in just 5 unforgettable minutes between a Hollywood legend and a revolutionary from West Africa, and that spark was catching fire. In a glass tower in Brussels, a senior EU diplomat replayed Traoré's words on screen. "We don't need a voice, we are the voice." He tapped his pen, visibly uneasy. This rhetoric, it can reshape blocks. This isn't just anti-colonialism, this is post-Westernism. In Washington, a classified white paper quietly circulated through defense and diplomatic channels. Its title, "The Traoré Doctrine Emerging Threat or Emerging Model." No one was laughing now. One internal memo warned, if Traoré's influence continues to grow, the foundations of traditional aid and military partnerships across the Sahel and West Africa could begin to erode quickly. Meanwhile, back at the summit, a quiet delegate from the South Pacific approached Traoré. "Mr. President," she said softly, "you said what we've been thinking for years. Thank you." Those were the quiet words of a delegate from the South Pacific. Then came one from Colombia, then Palestine, then Haiti, in less than 24 hours. Traoré had become something he never asked, to be a voice for the voiceless across continents. That evening, in his hotel suite, he sat with 2 of his closest advisors. The mood was calm but serious. "They'll come after you harder now," one advisor warned. "Not with guns but with influence, spin, and attempts to discredit." Traoré nodded. He knew this was coming. Power never surrenders without first trying to smear what it can't silence. A pause. "What's the strategy?" the second advisor asked. Traoré turned to the window, looking out over the skyline. "Truth isn't a strategy," he said. "It's a seed. You water it once, the people do the rest." Meanwhile, on a different floor in the same hotel, Denzel sat alone watching a news segment titled "Traoré, the President Who Spoke Without Permission." He shook his head slowly, a quiet smile forming. Earlier, an off-camera interviewer had asked him, "Do you regret mocking his faith?" His reply had been honest. "I don't regret the challenge, but I do regret not realizing sooner that I wasn't challenging a man. I was challenging a movement." 3 days later, something unexpected happened in Lagos. Thousands of university students filled Freedom Square, holding signs that read, "We don't need permission to speak." No one had organized the protest. It grew on its own, shared through clips, tweets, and whispered late-night conversations in dorms. It wasn't a protest against anyone, it was a declaration of identity. In Nairobi, a small poetry group met in a packed bookstore and read Traoré's speech line by line. In Soweto, a mural appeared overnight, his face painted beside Mandela's. In Atlanta, a black pastor rewrote his Sunday sermon after watching the panel. This young man from Burkina Faso, he told his congregation, he didn't just challenge a celebrity. He reminded us that silence is also betrayal. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré's plane had just landed. The crowd at the airport was far bigger than anyone expected. Thousands of everyday people came not to welcome a politician, but to honor a man who had defended their dignity on a global stage. The military tried to hold the line, but Traoré stepped out of the convoy and walked among the people. They didn't scream or cheer wildly. Instead, they nodded, placed hands over hearts, and gently touched his shoulder. It was quiet, powerful, almost sacred. But across town in the capital's foreign embassy district, a very different conversation was taking place. Inside the French diplomatic residence, 2 officials spoke urgently in sharp French. "His popularity is becoming a security concern," one said. "He's no longer just a local disruptor, he's building a Pan-African mythology." The other nodded. "And the Americans are watching. They admire his message, but they're afraid of what it might spark." "So what's our move?" the younger official asked. The older one poured a glass of wine, paused, then answered coldly. "We isolate him, discredit him, find a crack in his armor. Everyone has one." Meanwhile, back at the presidential palace, Traoré sat at his desk reading a printed email from a teenager in Ghana. It ended with the words, "Before I heard you speak, I thought faith was weakness. Now I believe it's the only way forward." He folded the letter, set it gently on the table, and whispered to himself, "When one man speaks, a million wake up." But somewhere in the shadows, another decision had already Then made, one man must fall. 2 weeks after the summit, a strange article appeared in a major European political magazine. Traoré, the demagogue dressed as a Democrat. It was filled with unnamed sources, claims of authoritarianism, suppression of dissent, and the so-called militarization of faith. No official documents were cited because none were needed. The intent was clear. Traoré wasn't dangerous because he was wrong, but because he was working. The article spread quickly not among ordinary people, but through diplomatic circles, NGOs, think tanks, and Western media. In Washington, a senior aide to the Secretary of State circled 3 lines. In red ink, Traoré's influence threatens U.S. regional partnerships. He turns belief into policy, making him unpredictable. He is more admired than controlled. Traoré saw the article too. He didn't respond publicly. But behind closed doors he was direct. They've moved to phase 2 narrative warfare, he said. Don't fight their words, show results. And he did. Within days, his administration launched 3 new regional programs: agricultural scholarships for rural girls, solar-powered water systems for drought-hit provinces, and a cultural exchange with Cuba and Indonesia. While Traoré built, others dug. In Paris, a covert strategy group met for the 4th time. On the wall was a large board labeled Operation Reframe. Underneath were tactics: paint him as isolated, use former allies, twist religious language, find the fracture point. A French analyst pointed at a photo. This is Denzel. He still holds global influence. What if he spoke again? The strategist asked, not to attack, but to shift the tone, reframe the narrative, plant doubt, redirect sympathy. After a pause, there was a simple nod. Make it happen. Across the U.S., Denzel Washington received a call from someone he respected deeply, a former senator turned think tank advisor. You know, the summit made waves, the voice said. You should shape the legacy of that moment before someone else does. Denzel hesitated. So you think I should speak again, not to go against him, but to remind people what's at stake? Exactly. You don't want to look like you're endorsing radicalism. That night, Denzel sat in front of a blank page. He didn't know exactly what he believed anymore, but he knew one thing: the story wasn't over. And in Ouagadougou, under a starry sky, Ibrahim Traoré said quietly to his closest aide, "They're trying to change the story, so now we write the ending ourselves." The lights in the Manhattan studio blazed. The stage was modern, sharp, global. A primetime international talk show had brought together 2 unexpected guests for a post-summit discussion: Denzel Washington and President Ibrahim Traoré. It wasn't called a debate, but everyone watching knew it would become one. 2 men to continents, 2 voices that shook the world stage last month. The host said, "Tonight, they meet not as enemies but as men trying to understand each other." Denzel nodded politely. Traoré sat still, no tie, just his green tunic a quiet symbol. The opening question was gentle, but then came the spark. "Mr. Washington," the host asked, "do you regret what you said at the summit?" Denzel took a breath. "I regret underestimating a man's conviction. I challenged something I didn't fully understand, but I still believe that faith without room for questions can become dogma. That's all I was trying to say." The moderator turned to Traoré. "President Traoré, do you accept that?" Traoré leaned in. "I don't mind questions," he said. "What I mind is when only one side is allowed to ask them. You questioned my faith in front of the world. That's fine, but you never asked why I believe." The room went silent. "You say faith without doubt is dangerous, I agree. But so is logic without soul. What built empires wasn't just knowledge, it was belief. What freed slaves wasn't just laws, it was faith. A man doesn't cross a desert with a spreadsheet. He crosses it with the fire in his chest." The silence that followed was full. Then applause broke out, not forced, not polite, just real. Denzel looked at him. "Maybe we're not so different," he said. Traoré nodded. "Maybe we are, but maybe that's the point. The world doesn't need 2 of me or 2 of you. It needs both of us talking, not tearing." After the show, backstage and off camera, they shook hands. No script, no performance. Just 2 voices, still different but finally listening. Not as friends, not as allies, just 2 men who saw something in each other they didn't expect. As Traoré stepped out of the studio into the New York night, a young man stopped him on the sidewalk. "Sir," he said, catching his breath, "I'm from Haiti. My grandmother used to pray every morning for our freedom. I thought it was silly, but tonight, you made me understand that was her power." Traoré smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then never laugh at the weapon that protected your house while you slept." And with that, he disappeared into the city lights. But his words stayed behind, not loud, not forced, just there quietly, echoing. Because sometimes the most powerful message isn't the one that silences a room. It's the one that wakes the world. Denzel walked in holding onto his beliefs. Traoré didn't argue, he reflected them back. This wasn't just a conversation between two public figures. It was a collision between those who question belief and those who live by it. Some find strength in asking, others carry answers, like a quiet flame, and often, the strongest response isn't a punch, it's a pause. The world doesn't need two of me or two of you. It needs one of each, talking, not tearing. If this story moved something in you, maybe the real battle isn't in studios or speeches, it's in the heart. If you felt the power of this moment, like, comment, and share. Subscribe to hear what comes next, because sometimes the truth doesn't shout, it simply stands tall.